or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I can work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lashes well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with a mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? I wanted to begin with these words from Sojourner Truth, who gave this speech back in 1851. In the words, "Ain't I a woman?" Miss Sojourner Truth was clearly articulating the simultaneous experience of the multiple oppressions of race, class, and gender faced by black women. And while the term intersectionality wasn't coined until over 130 years later by Kimberly Crenshaw, Miss Sojourner had already described it to a T. Intersectionality holds that the multiple forms of oppression within society do not act independently of one another. Instead, they interrelate, creating a system of multiple forms of discrimination. And I want you to hold on to that idea of intersectionality. So while I am honored to share in this momentous occasion here today in Walnut Creek for women's empowerment and equality, I'd like to share that my initial plan for the day was to be at the National March in D.C. And as I was really excited to go and be a part of what I believe will be an historical moment, I quickly learned from an open letter that the movement was showing signs of not being an intersectional movement. There were issues that women of color are quite familiar with. The first issue was appropriation of the name of the march by calling it the Million Women March, when in fact, the Million Women March had taken place 20 years earlier, organized by women of color who felt they'd been excluded from the mainstream women's movement. Over 750,000 women of color showed for that event to focus on their adversities, their circumstances, and their successes. A second issue was the fact that, again, women of color were being excluded from leadership roles, and the issues and concerns they were raising that were important for them were being pushed aside. And although eventually there was some resolve, new leadership, and inclusivity, by then I just decided not to go. Because while the fight for women's equality has been a significant one, bringing to light suffrage rights, reproductive rights, and income inequalities, the plight of women of color in this movement has been persistently overlooked. Because the fight for equality for women did not necessarily translate into the fight for equality for women of color, especially black women. Let's take a look back. During the mid-19th century, there were alliances between those in the abolitionist movement and those beginning to advocate for women's rights of suffrage. However, after the decision was made to exclude women from the 15th Amendment, which gave free black men the right to vote in theory, leading suffragists Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton adopted blatantly racist rhetoric. White suffragists despised the idea that black men might get to vote ahead of white women. Frustrated, they actively courted and collaborated with white supremacists in exchange for financial assistance to advance their cause. By aligning themselves with white men, these early feminists turned their backs on black women, and moreover, when black suffragists were allowed to join in the campaigns, the white women blatantly requested that they walk in the back of the parade. During the next wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s, a similar strategy played out. Women of color were still relegated to the sidelines while white women became the face of feminism. Organizations fighting for women's rights deliberately excluded their black and brown sisters so as to appear more acceptable to white male legislators who held the power. And when women of color spoke truthfully about their issues around racism, they were told they were being divisive and should only be focusing on the real enemy, patriarchy and sexism. And so the master frames of the women's movement have always highlighted the white experience, taking on a colorblind approach that sought to protect and advance middle and upper class white women, rather than promoting the well-being of all women. That's why intersectionality matters. Because all women are not the same. We have multiple intersecting identities that affect the way we live and are treated in the world. While I love my white sisters, and I'm with you in this struggle for women's rights, we cannot continue to pretend that the experiences of straight, white, middle-class women are synonymous with all womanhood. A lack of intersectionality leads to an erasure of people and their identities. And a movement without an intersectional lens cannot be truly anti-oppressive and cannot claim to fight for the advancement of all women. So, how do we do this? Adopting an intersectional framework involves looking within ourselves to those places where we feel challenged, but with a desire to learn about issues and identities that do not impact us personally. It involves empathizing with people who are not like us. It involves stepping back instead of speaking over others. It involves allowing those unheard voices to be heard. It involves opening yourself up to a high level of personal accountability. It involves being anti-racist. Just saying I'm not racist is not ending racism. When you exist in a place of colorblindness, claiming not to see race, being a bystander, and not confronting racial issues, it makes you a passive perpetuator of racism, thus part of the problem. To be a part of the solution, you have to be an active anti-racist leader who consciously and deliberately interrupts racism. Now, there are those who say this problem is too big and there's nothing I can do. Well, a white colleague of mine told me that as a white woman, she finally realized that all she needs to do to interrupt is to push the pause button and put a stutter in the dominant discourse. So as a close, I'm calling for action. Let's make sure this moment counts, this day, this march, this movement. We should not be here just to say we did this. We participated. We have to walk away from here better than when we came, and walking away with a purpose, a plan of action to make things better for all women. And the only way we can do that is by coming together across all races, genders, ethnicities, nationalities, religions, love orientations, and start listening, honoring, and respecting each other's experiences in a collective fight. And I just want to end with one last sentence from Miss Sojourner, who had the answer back in 1851. She said, "If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again." Thank you.